we go ahead and get started as people are joining in? I want to thank everybody for joining today, and especially our just amazing group of panelists who've joined us. Our goal today is to really kind of grapple a little bit with the difficult questions tied to developing standards to evaluate digital mental health interventions. It is not an easy task to think about the right approaches to do that, and we have an amazing group assembled here who've been really thinking about these issues for a very long time and working at them from very different angles. And so we're thrilled to kind of have them here and hear their perspectives. And our goal today is to kind of get some of the difficult questions on the table, have some discussion, and then after the break, we'll be moving to breakout groups to kind of get your feedback on how to think about these issues, what the field needs to be doing, and what are good steps to be moving forward. So what I'd like to do is start by briefly introducing our wonderful panelists. And for each, I'll invite them to say a little bit about kind of what their roles are and how they've been working on these issues. Then we'll open it up for questions that I've asked them to think a little bit about in advance tied to this topic. And then please add your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to make sure we save time to get your questions answered as well. Of course, we won't cover everything. Some things will get moved to the breakout rooms, but we'll do our best. So first, let me welcome Pat Areán, who is a professor in the University of Washington's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and a licensed clinical psychologist. Among her many areas of expertise are cross-cultural mental health and the acceptability of using digital data for the purpose of screening and treating mental illnesses. Pat, do you want to share a little bit?
Yeah, I'll just kind of focus on what I've been doing around creating guidelines and standards for reviewing the quality of both psychosocial interventions and digital health. I was on the American Psychological Association's advisory panel for developing the means by which they were going to create clinical guidelines. And so in that role, had reviewed all of the ways that these guidelines are created, both internationally in the VA and within our own, the United States. I also co-chaired the Banbury meeting with Dr. Moore, that is in part kind of responsible for the creation of this society. And I also chaired the NIMH advisory work group on standards for technology and the use of behavioral sciences. And then in that work group report, which is on the NIMH website, you can see that we also address some of the issues around how do you evaluate the scientific, or what are the best scientific methods for studying these novel technologies.
Wonderful, thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Megan Coder, who is the Chief Policy Officer of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, and which is an international nonprofit trade association of industry leaders and stakeholders that are dedicated to improving clinical and health economic outcomes through the use of high-quality, evidence-based digital therapeutics. And she founded Digital Therapeutic Alliance in 2017, I believe. And has been instrumental in many initiatives, including their recent digital treatment value assessment and integration guide. So let me welcome you.
Thank you. So I'm thrilled to be here. And with DTA, I've been involved in it from the start. And a lot of our work has really been looking at the foundation of how do we build up this industry in terms of what's the definition of a digital therapeutic and what core principles should they meet. And a lot of that led to eventually this value assessment guide that we published this past month, really looking at this idea of how do we start to harmonize the understandings around what digital therapeutics are and how do you evaluate them and how do you implement them. So talking more about that later. And then over time, I've also started to become more engaged in the standard setting world of ISO and IEC, and throw in a few other letters in there too. So it's been really interesting to see it more from the industry side and then more of that global healthcare medical device side too. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Next, I'd like to introduce Nathaniel Counts, who is the Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health Innovation for Mental Health America, and also a Clinical Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And Nathaniel leads policy research and advocacy centered around addressing social and economic determinants of behavioral health, prevention and population health strategies, and the economics of investing to improve behavioral health.
Thank you so much for having me, especially on this wonderful panel. So I guess our big role, I like to think of us as, sort of like leaders in the advocacy space around the future of technology and innovation as it relates to mental health. And so most specifically in this space, Megan and I co-hosted like a few years ago, what I think was probably the first major policy Hill event around digital therapeutics and mental health.
I was pretty impressed that digital therapeutics were even on your radar at that time. So yeah, you were like a pioneer.
Yeah, I mean, it was exciting. Like it was before even like a single thing was FDA approved, and everything was all hopes and dreams. And then so it was really exciting, a lot of fun. And then more recently, with the two APAs, we co-hosted an event on. So thank you, Nicole, for all your help. The sort of like future of regulation and payment, and we had Bakul Patel when he was still at FDA speak, and then Dr. Mina Jasmani from CMS come and talk about sort of like their thoughts about FDA and Medicare as it relates to digital therapeutics. And we continue to stay in the space and trying to figure out how to advance innovation.
Fabulous. Next, I'd like to introduce Nicole Owings-Fonner, who is the Director of Operations and Innovation at the American Psychological Association. And she leads initiatives around APA's contributions to practice innovation, the promotion of routine measurement, and the provision of psychological services. And she is the author of Let's Get Technical, which is a quarterly column reviewing the latest apps and tools for practicing psychologists. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really, our office is the Office of Healthcare Innovation within the Practice Directorate at APA. And we really focus on using data and technology to improve the quality of care and improve access to care. So all of what's being spoken about at this panel is really relevant to the work that we're doing. And I've been very fortunate to sit on the Clinician Advisory Committee at DTA, working on the guide that I know Megan will be talking about, and working with Nathaniel on different advocacy efforts, as well as working with Stephen in partnership with PsyberGuide to work on the Let's Get Technical column and to look at the different technology coming out. So thank you.
Terrific. And last but not least, I'm thrilled to introduce Stephen Schueller, who is an associate professor of psychological science and informatics at the University of California, Irvine, and an adjunct associate professor of preventive medicine at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. And his research focuses on increasing the accessibility and availability of mental health resources through the use of technology. And he is the executive director of OneMind PsyberGuide, which reviews apps based on the app's credibility, user experience, and transparency.
Thanks, Bethany. I'm really excited to be on this panel, especially with so many amazing experts that I look to so often for advice and just leadership in this space. So as Bethany mentioned, I lead a project of OneMind called OneMind PsyberGuide, which is kind of like a consumer reports of digital mental health products. So we identify, evaluate, and disseminate information about digital mental health products to help consumers make informed decisions. OneMind PsyberGuide has been around for about 7 or 8 years now. And I tell people when we started, there was not a lot around and not a lot of evidence. And now there's a lot around and not a lot of evidence. And I think it really shows the need for a panel like this. Also note, at UC Irvine, another hat I wear is we are the evaluation team of Help at Hand, which is a 15 county and city collaborative project in California to use digital mental health tools in county mental health services. And so we've learned a lot through that evaluation about some of the processes and the challenges and just, a lot of the things that are out there that people are trying to use in real world settings and the challenges about, not knowing what to use and how to use it. And I think that's another reason why standards are so necessary. So it's really great to be on this panel and really excited to have this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, let's dive in. The place I'd like to start is thinking about sort of the incredibly potentially broad space of figuring out what criteria we should be using to evaluate. So how do you think about the relative importance of different possible criteria for evaluating digital mental health treatment? So you could be thinking about efficacy, you can see about risk of iatrogenic effects, so that cause and harm, you can be thinking about patient burden, patient values and preferences, evidence with diverse samples, accessibility issues. I mean, there's so many possible buckets of criteria that we might want to consider. And I'm wondering how to approach that in terms of sort of how to weight those and how to think about those. And Nicole, maybe I'll ask you to start us off.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot to look at. And one of the perspectives that we look at for providers or for patients is it depends on the purpose or the claims of the tool. So are you talking about a wellness app, a psychoeducational app, or something to do tracking, or are you talking about something that's diagnostic or provides an actual intervention? And if it provides an intervention, what is what is the way that it's used? So is it used on its own? Is it used as an adjunct to treatment? Is it under the guidance of a mental behavioral health professional? So depending on where it falls in kind of that continuum, we'd be looking at different levels of efficacy and different levels of risk and how it fits with the patient's preferences and their diverse background. We have, like I said, greater expectations for those claiming to treat a disorder. But at the population health level, it's also important to weigh the risks versus not receiving any treatment at all, or not receiving treatment until symptoms have worsened. And so for our Let's Get Technical column, we asked our panel reviewers to evaluate digital mental health technology on a list of criteria without placing one criteria with more weight over the other, with the hopes that our readers will then be able to focus on which criteria is most salient for their individual patient or for their population, and to consider the patient's values and preferences and specific goals and where they are in treatment. And one possible exception to this might be standards around privacy and security. We really want patients and clinicians to know what the specific privacy and security risks are before they've started using the digital mental health treatment. A lot of times you are required to create some sort of account and share all sorts of information before you even view the privacy policy and the security policy. And so we really feel strongly that that's something that should be upfront. And then just one final thing is to take into account what are some factors that will help optimize the use of the treatment. So what are the most effective methods? Is it checking in? How is it being monitored by a professional? What is the sequence of use they should be following? That sort of thing. So we really want to look at what does the real world engagement look like outside of perhaps in a clinical trial.
Absolutely. Do others want to comment on that?
I'll just comment on a point that Nicole made, I think is really important, which is I think we have to think a lot about what the comparison groups are. I get asked a question a lot about like, well, is this technology better than a therapist? And the answer is often no, but that's not the question in a lot of places and not how many of these tools might be able to be used. And for many folks, it's not a question of, am I going to go see a therapist or I'm going to use a digital mental health product? There are a lot of folks who don't have access to care. But I think in light of that, I think we also have to make sure that we really ensure we're not doing harm from the different technologies or products that are out there. And so I think standards around safety and security and potential iatrogenic effects, which are often not looked at in a lot of studies, I think are really important as well to make sure that we can actually do that responsibly. Greg Simon's group had a really great paper recently that was showing some iatrogenic effects from a brief digital intervention that was given for individuals with suicidal ideation. And so I think it's also not true that something is always better than nothing. And I think that's something we have to remember in this space.
Absolutely. Pat.
Yes. So just following up on that, I think one thing that we tend to forget when we're, thinking about standards or even developing our interventions is the role that the end user feels that these tools should play. So, I agree with Nicole, like lumping digital mental health into one bucket is not fair because there are a lot of different types of digital mental health tools that do different things. But I think we also have an assumption that these tools or some people have an assumption that these tools are somehow replacing the mental health system. And my experience in working with, on large scale field trials of these tools is that oftentimes, people use these tools very differently than what you see in the typical therapeutic encounter. They use it more frequently, very early on. And they also, one interesting finding we've had from some of our research partnering with companies is that sometimes these digital tools are meant as a holding pattern. This is how people are using them until they find something in person. And so it's kind of the way these tools were developed originally. My recollection is that Beating the Blues was actually originally a waiting list kind of activity for people with depression, and that they found that a fair number of people got better with that, and other people, were stabilized until they could get access to somebody who was well trained in an evidence-based intervention. So the voice of the consumer, I think, is going to be really important in helping us evaluate, what these tools should do. Are they effective? What the effectiveness value should be when we're evaluating them.
Wonderful. Let me ask now a little bit about what's known about what efforts that you're aware of, either domestically or internationally, that could serve as models to develop standards to evaluate digital mental health treatments. And as we know from the intros, I'm going to have Megan kind of jump in on this, as I know you have some things to share in this space.
So this is where I do look forward to the full group discussion on this one. As we've been talking, Nicole, you brought up a point that, you brought up many points there that were really excellent, but one of them was this idea of like, what does the product do? What is its intended use? And a lot of what I'm focused on are really those that are using software to deliver an intervention to a patient. We're not looking at anything that's like really in that pure play diagnostic or monitoring or wellness or adherence spaces, albeit digital therapeutics can incorporate those factors too as appropriate. We're really looking at those that are, again, using software to deliver a treatment or a therapy. So when we're looking at this, a lot of our efforts have really been focused on that idea around let's make sure you have the right medical claims, and let's make sure you have patient engagement throughout the entire life cycle and process. So when we first launched DTA, we really looked at this idea of let's build out at least 10 principles where we can say, we would expect that all products in this industry to be safe, effective, robust, and trustworthy for a patient's use. Here to these 10 principles, and those relate to a lot of those core ideas around really ensuring that if a software product is making the claims it's making, that should be able to reliably do that. So our efforts have really been focused on that. What intrigues me, though, is the other efforts taking place around this panel and then externally too, even internationally right now, of trying to evaluate mental health products. Even ISO has a standard that they created, 82304-2. A year ago, they released it, I believe, that's looking at this notion around evaluating mental health apps and somewhat looking like a wash machine readout of like, what color is it and how can I trust the validity of it? So there's all these different things taking place. And I think from my perspective is how can I use our DTX perspective to either improve upon or infuse it into other efforts, and or is there a way we come together? What's the best way to really create some understanding and again, harmonization? It's like my favorite word recently, but that's something that I'm looking to see more of what we can do using some of the individual pieces that each of us have been building individually.
I think that's great. Would others like to share other initiatives they're aware of?
Go ahead, Stephen, since you are host one of them, please.
Go ahead, Nathaniel.
I was just say, I mean, so of course, besides students, the American Psychiatric has as a template, and then HRQ just came up with something. But the one thing I wanted to touch on, kind of reflecting on some of Stephen's earlier points about comparison groups and like thinking about like how do we evaluate it. I think because like one big evaluation thing that's happening right now is kind of what Azim just brought up, which is that there's like payers are building ecosystems that sort of like try to target and identify what might be most effective for each person. And I was thinking like I think the calculus about what's most effective and how you evaluate it dramatically changes whether it's like a dead cold formulary versus an interactive platform. And so I think it's fair to think of like what payers are currently doing as a kind of framework. And I think it changes because like when you think about like what's the comparison group, when you're just comparing it to the state of the world as it is, like that's one question. But as we have more apps that are effective, the biggest risk will be confusion among each other, right? That will begin emerging as probably the single most salient risk, and you don't want like a less effective app deterring someone from using a more effective app. And then I feel like the magic of it being digital is that you could evaluate it using real world evidence more so. So I think that kind of what FDA has on paper about the pre-cert program and some of his early thoughts about real world evidence could actually be one of the most, and the way that CMS does some of its like payment approaches to novel technologies using real world evidence as well could be some of the most promising approaches to dealing with these framework issues. But I think the calculus is totally different when you're just looking at like a cold dead formulary, like what's most effective in general, I would say.
Great, and I'm guessing that there's a wide array of backgrounds among our audience. Do you want to define some of the acronyms you're using, like CMS?
Oh, sorry, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So they have a whole pathway for, I guess I'll talk about the few things I just mentioned. So starting with the pre-certification program, if people aren't familiar. So FDA outlined, like kind of acknowledging that the way digital tools works is extremely different from the way medications work, right? Like you come up with a molecule, it is that molecule, it keeps being that molecule forever, versus, ideally, once you have some amount of user feedback, you would tweak the app, and then, as to Stephen's point, like an iatrogenic effect could suddenly appear or disappear. We don't know, depending on what the impact is. So they came up with a framework that allows companies to kind of like have a different level of review if they meet a whole bunch of different kind of criteria. Like there's sort of like everything from their organizational practices to the way they collect and use data from patients. And I think that might be a further discussion, but unfortunately it hasn't really taken off because FDA doesn't have the resources or authority necessarily to fully implement the pre-certification program at scale. And then once it gets through the FDA process, it needs to get paid for. And so Medicare is a major payer, and it kind of sets the standard for a lot of different payers. So even though it mostly is focused on older adults, and older adults only use some fraction of services, like Optum would be, like United would be a major payer, they still often defer to Medicare's payment regime. So it matters quite a lot sort of how they view it. And they have these different processes where they have you collect data to decide like how effective is this when it's a totally untested thing, to see how much they should pay.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And in some ways, you were previewing tomorrow's panel on reimbursement mechanism, which is wonderful. Thinking further about the sort of criteria we should be using to think about evaluation, FDA is going to, or FDA approval will provide sort of basic assurance of efficacy, but it doesn't cover a lot of the things that we might think are important. And so I'd be curious to hear from the panel, what type of review process would you hope to see to ensure application of a sort of rigorous evaluation framework? Stephen, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a challenging question. And I think that some of the things that the panel has already brought up, I think are really important points. Like as Nathaniel was speaking, I was thinking a lot about like fit for context, in that for different uses, there are probably different criteria or different weights of criteria that might be more meaningful. So this idea of having, so like the Mental Health Commission of Canada, for example, is trying to come up with some standards that might be able to be used across Canada, versus a project like Kaiser's Project Kamai, which is trying to identify some very specific apps that they want to provide to their members. Or a clinician who's just trying to make a decision like, is this an app that I could recommend confidently to a client, which I know is a lot of the stuff that Nicole thinks about sometimes in the work that she does. I think one thing, and I love the report that DTA put out recently, Megan, and one of my favorite parts of that report is the table you all have of some of the different types of evidence that might be useful to speak to different questions, because I think that that's really, I think that there's a lot of focus on this field about like the sort of sort of protection or raising up of like the randomized control study. It's like, was an RCT done on this particular product, which I think is extremely valuable, but it's not the only type of evidence that's out there. And so I think that we need to really think about what are the different types of evidence, what questions do they answer, and then what are the questions that are being raised for the different uses and deployment settings of different standards. And I think we have to think about how we bring those aspects together to make standards that are useful and actionable for different places where people want to use these tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the comment about the RCT as a gold standard kind of comes from how guidelines and systematic reviews that inform policy, like in other countries, I think the VA uses the same standards, that is somewhat informed by, that is how evidence is graded. So there are, I think as we're thinking about how do we evaluate digital mental health, we also have to think about what the standards are in general for evaluating, interventions for disease states. And even within that, there's the grade system, there is Guidelines International, and there is room to, say that something is worthwhile based on not just the RCT gold standard, but, the level of quality of field trials, which is where we learn a lot about how interventions actually work. And they're not always randomized. There are lots of other methodologies that are pseudo-randomization that, can inform that work. So I think it's fantastic that there are all these different ways. I think it's important that there are other things we need to evaluate that aren't typical in these like Guideline International or, the ARC guidelines for, evaluating evidence-based treatments, but they could be built on top of what clinicians and healthcare organizations already are familiar with, just with the added caveat that one of the questions that we got was, is anybody looking at the privacy rules from or how privacy and security is communicated to someone who uses these tools is a huge problem. But is very important because of all of the, interesting things that happen with people's data without them knowing.
No, absolutely. And Pat, that's a great leading to the next question I wanted to raise, which you've partially touched on. But how would the panel envision that clinical practice guidelines for digital mental health treatments would be the same or different as the many sort of clinical practice guidelines that are out there for therapies, medications, other treatment modalities, et cetera? Nicole, let me loop back around to you on this.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts here. So clinical practice guidelines, they serve to answer the question of what treatments are efficacious, what levels the treatment recommended based on the strength of the scientific evidence. So do you recommend it strongly, conditionally? And so thinking about how you define the scope of evidence for inclusion in the guidelines will be critical. And one of the things that we're thinking about is it an issue of looking at a specific digital mental health treatment versus a broader category of treatments, like cognitive behavioral therapy? Would each individual digital mental health treatment be evaluated separately, like is the case for medications? Would you have a clinical practice guideline for different types of digital treatments, like chatbots would have one, or virtual reality would have one? And how do you keep
Yeah.
Right. What level do you look at? And then how do you keep up? Clinical practice guidelines, I know on our side, they take several years to put together, and treatments are coming out way more quickly than that. And then also, should stakeholders be advocating for more interdisciplinary guidelines on something like digital tools, given that there's many more professions who are working in this area than just where the clinical practice guidelines tend to come out of? So how can we promote more integrated care delivery in terms of clinical practice guidelines?
Other comments that people want to share on the sort of guideline aspect of it?
I think it's going to be interesting, and I'm probably not the most well equipped on this one, so I look for others jumping in. But it is that notion, and Nathaniel, you touched on a little bit, but so my background's as a pharmacist, and you still have this idea of you have medication interactions. I think that notion of having interactions with digital, so a digital interaction or digital medication interaction, when do you start them? Do you start them 6 weeks apart, 2 weeks apart, at the same time? And then notions around, do you start a digital product first and then eventually escalate to drug in certain situations, or start drug, escalate to digital? Like, all of these notions, I do look forward for a lot more science to be put behind this. I think the efficacy of the products, the strength and the rigor and robustness of making sure that they're able to do what they need to do, but then how do they interrelate with the rest of therapy? That is an area of horizon I really look forward to seeing more work done in, and we're still early stages on that regard, I think.
Absolutely. Nathaniel.
The thing is, you both were talking too. I mean, I guess it also depends on how we visualize it. Like, we're doing treatment guidelines for like a therapy, right? We like meta-analyze like all of the trials in a certain thing, but like that might not make sense. Like depression apps, for example, like one might be like tremendously more effective. So then you kind of get into this, I guess, like squeamish space of recommending certain products, which I think, you know, when you're recommending medications, there is like some can be more effective than others, but I think how you visualize it is going to be tough. One other quick thing I wanted to say too is people were talking before about the efficacy levels. I think one thing that I guess the whole group should probably think about is like, how different do you want it to be from medications? Like, should the barrier actually be higher? Like, I would be concerned if, for example, there was a higher demonstration of efficacy than medication. So I think it's just like something worth thinking about, like how similar, different, and like why does it deviate when we do? Because it would be like sort of like interesting. And I don't know how I'd feel like if it was like harder to get an app approved than a medication approved. I just throw that out there.
Stephen and then Pat. Oh, Stephen, you're muted.
Yep, it has to happen to someone first. So I want to comment on something that Megan said, because also made me think of something I saw in the chat that Melissa Hunt wrote about the FDA pathway that leads to this prescription digital therapeutic aspect, which I think, these have an important role to play. But I think one of the challenges is I'm a clinical psychologist by my training. If there is a prescription digital therapeutic, I will not be able to prescribe it. And I've helped create many of these types of interventions. And so I think we have to make sure that the standards we use in the evaluation pathways and the integration pathways make sure we have the right interdisciplinary collection of people able to help support it. And that includes psychologists and technologists and a variety of different people. And so I think that's one of the value of a broad tent society like the Society for Digital Mental Health here. But I think we really need to make sure how we have the right expertise to be able to think about those interactions and best use and things of that nature that like Megan was bringing up. So I think it's a really important thing to think about, not just, I think it's important to think about how these new technologies allow sort of new workflows and making sure the right expertise is present to be able to make sure that consumers are not harmed and really benefited from what's possible out there.
And we'll have Pat and Nicole, and then we'll try to hit a couple of the wonderful questions that have been coming in from the audience.
Yeah, I think one thing, and this is back to the how quickly the field or the population of apps grows, and but if you look at them, they're they do fall into different buckets, but sometimes these new apps are variations of other apps. And so some of what we grappled with both at the NIMH technology work group and at Banbury Forum was that comparing app A to, CBT app A to a CBT app B didn't seem to make a lot of sense when you are trying to, evaluate, the criteria. What you really need to do is to think about what is it that about CBT app A that was found to be effective in the RCT, what were the elements of those apps? What were the principles? And does CBT app B have those features in place? So it kind of, I think, speeds up the process of doing the systematic reviews and all of that, which actually I think there's a room for technology to speed that process up. There's been some work around using natural language processing to curate the information from the field so that you can get much more rapid review, and that sometimes those processes are actually better than the double-blind review that happens with the systematic in-person systematic review process. But all this is to say is that, when there's a brand new innovation, like this intervention targets this particular neurocircuit in the brain, then yes, that needs to undergo its own evaluation. But if it's, another CBT app, it may just be, as long as the features are there, maybe what this new app is doing is enhancing consumer engagement. So, yeah, again, I think we need to think about these in terms of principles and not in terms of, the variety of hundreds of apps that are out there, or thousands actually.
And am I right, Nicole, you were next?
Sure. So I think those were really good points. And I just actually wanted to jump back for a second to something that Stephen said, and I see what's happening in the chat is, I wanted to share that some of the advocacy efforts happening at APA right now are working to ensure that psychologists and other mental health professionals do have access to prescription digital therapeutics, and that psychologists are not left out. And we've been working with our consultants to ensure that the FDA's definition of a digital or prescription therapeutic is not the same as the state level licensing requirements. And so, as someone pointed out, there are prescription treatments that psychologists are able to prescribe, and we're working with the industry to make sure that psychologists and other mental health professionals are included in the labeling as a health professional who can order those prescription digital therapeutics. And so that is high on our radar. We wouldn't want psychologists or any other mental health professional to be left out.
No, that's fantastic. So first, let me say we have a ton of great questions that are coming in both through chat and through the Q&A. If any of our panelists want to answer live to some of the ones that are in the Q&A, feel free to jump on. I'm going to pick just one to get us started on now, since we won't get to all of them, but hopefully in our breakout groups we can hit more. But one question came in about, I'm wondering what have been found as key determinants for the effectiveness of online interventions, such as one-on-one communication with some type of professional. Who would like to tackle that?
Yeah, well, I can say generally the evidence supports that digital mental health interventions, when used on their own, are consistently but have small impacts. And I think, you know, we can have discussions outside of this and in the future about like, well, how big of an impact is important to be impactful and what are the different use cases. But the evidence shows that those are, you know, small to moderate effect sizes. But then when combined with some sort of human support, and Dr. Moore mentioned this a little bit in his introduction, they're usually found to be quite effective as traditional treatments, and that that support does not necessarily need to come from a trained professional. You know, in some of our own studies, we've used trained research assistants, peers, I think is a really interesting opportunity to move forward. So, but some type of human support seems to be characteristic of the most effective treatments. I think we're still learning a lot about, you know, where the evidence is in different things. Digital cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be extremely well supported, especially in the areas of depression, anxiety, some strong evidence in post-traumatic stress disorder, but again, most of the studies are in depression and anxiety.
I just wanted to follow up on a point that Stephen made, is that, you know, one of the challenges, so some of the what's considered digital mental health is really just a communication platform between therapists and patients, right? So, you know, SMS technologies, video, on-demand video conferencing. And, you know, it's a great way to facilitate access to a therapist, but we still haven't solved the problem that the quality of therapy, particularly here in the US, is questionable, right? And so it's not going to solve that problem until somebody solves the problem of how do we ensure that somebody who says they're doing CBT is actually doing CBT and not just saying that they do CBT, or maybe they know how to do it, but they're not delivering it well over the platform. So I do think that there's a level of necessity around credentialing, you know, around the clinicians who actually use these platforms, because it is, particularly the SMS engagement, is very different than what you do as a once a week therapeutic or once every other week therapeutic encounter.
Absolutely. So let's try and see if we can quickly squeeze in one more. So as compared to software product development, clinical intervention development has different standards and evidence requirements, metrics. How do we balance the two? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Isn't it a little bit of both? So the notion that these are, at least the digital therapeutic side, are medical devices. So software development is a big part of it. Quality management systems is a big part of it. Doing all of the regulatory requirements is a big part of it. And then you have the clinical side, and then the patient usability and patient centricity and language and cultural aspects. So you're layering a lot of things on top of it here. So I wouldn't compare them. I would actually just kind of layer them on top of each other to say, if you're in that space, you're going to have to be looking at all of these things. But Nathaniel, raise your hand and you have more to say on it, is my guess.
I was just say to that point, like, I think the dream world would be if like NIH, like the research funders, talk to FDA, talk to CMS and payers, and there was sort of like a clear through line so that at every point each thing teed itself up for the next thing. And then that question would sort of sort itself out to what to the point you're making.
And that's a perfect place for us to wrap up on the importance of really connecting all of the different, you know, stakeholders and interested parties so that this is done in a thoughtful and integrated way, and all of those pieces. And to that effort, we're really looking forward to continuing this discussion in the breakout groups. So we'll give people a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and invite everyone to join the discussion. Let me first, though, give a huge thanks to all of our panelists. We could talk for about 4 hours with the questions that came in and the thoughtful comments in the chat. So hopefully this is, you know, one of many conversations on this important topic, but a huge thank you to you all for joining. And what I would suggest, you can leave your Zoom event open, everyone. And then when you come back, you can just please join the breakout groups to discuss developing standards session. And then we'll automatically assign you to a breakout group to continue the conversation. So thank you all, and enjoy a few minutes break.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.